Since at least the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the world's dominant currency. It's the currency that financial institutions across the world overwhelmingly prefer to hold as reserves. It denominates most international trade, and it's the global benchmark for other currencies. However, in recent months, a confluence of factors, including America's ballooning debt pile, Trump's unpredictable trade policies, his revealed disdain for central bank independence, and his administration's willingness to use dollar-based sanctions against not just rogue states like Iran and Russia, but also ICC judges and European policymakers, have sparked speculation that the dollar's long-standing dominance might finally be coming to an end. So in this video, we thought we'd take another look at what might come next, and whether it'll be better or worse than what preceded it. So the first thing to say is that the dollar's demise is by no means certain. The US dollar has defied the doomsayers many times before, and still accounts for a majority of all foreign exchange reserves, about 90% of all foreign exchange transactions, and more than 50% of all export invoicing. The dollar's persistence reflects some fundamental strengths, including the size of the US economy, its relative openness, and the depth of its capital markets, which make it easier to borrow and trade in dollars. But it also reflects the staying power of what are known as network effects. In other words, everyone uses the dollar because, well, everyone else already uses the dollar, which means it's very hard to quit. Nonetheless, there are signs that the era of dollar dominance might finally be coming to a close. Its share of reserves fell to a 25-year low last year. The rise of gold could plausibly be construed as a symptom of waning confidence in the dollar, and, perhaps most notably, the dollar has decoupled from American bond yields for the first time in recent history. For context, when the dollar fell in the past, US borrowing costs usually fell as well, in large part because, in the same way that the US dollar is the world's favourite currency, US bonds are the world's favourite debt instruments. This meant that, when people moved out of dollars, they often moved into US bonds, and thus pushed down yields, effectively moving from one reserve asset to another. That this hasn't happened in the past year or so reflects the fact that neither the dollar nor US bonds are seen as quite as safe as they once were. Now, none of this suggests the dollar's demise is imminent, but it's worth noting that network effects generally act as a sort of dam. They contain and stem the original pressure, but once a critical threshold is reached and the proverbial dam breaks, things can unravel quite suddenly, especially if some competitor is beginning to enjoy the positive benefits of network effects itself. This is what happened to MySpace, for instance. Network effects protected it from Facebook until late 2008, when the dam suddenly broke. This happened, not coincidentally, at about the same time as Facebook was beginning to enjoy the positive effects of network effects, as evidenced by its exponential growth in this period. It's not impossible to imagine something similar, albeit not quite as dramatic, happening to the dollar, especially if some other currency emerges as a viable alternative. The moment of maximum vulnerability could plausibly come later in the year, once current Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has been replaced with Trump's chosen successor, Kevin Warsh. Warsh is generally seen as a less political choice than some of the other potential candidates, but if he ends up being yet another yes man, and, say, drastically cuts interest rates while inflation is well above the Fed's 2% target, you can imagine the inflationary risks becoming so acute that the proverbial dam just breaks. Anyway, however it happens, the point we're trying to make is that the end of dollar dominance no longer seems far-fetched. So, what would succeed it? Well, in the short term, the most likely outcome is some sort of multipolar currency system. After all, the dollar isn't going to suddenly disappear. It's been the world's reserve currency for decades, and the US will continue to be one of the world's two largest economies for the foreseeable future. In such a multipolar order, the dollar will still play a role, but alongside, rather than above, other major currencies like the euro, yen, and yuan. This sort of multipolar system will probably have a regional element. You can imagine, for instance, the euro dominating in Europe, the dollar dominating in the Americas, and the yuan dominating in the Asia Pacific. Now, some people like the idea of a multipolar currency order. It would give the US less unilateral leverage and make other regions less dependent on the US economy, which has been a key factor in recent financial crises. It's also worth noting that currency blocks were the norm until the gold standard emerged in the late 1800s. However, others aren't so relaxed about this prospect. Our collective reliance on the dollar has long acted as a sort of financial lubricant. Moving to other currencies would introduce some new exchange rate risk in international trade, making everything slightly more expensive. There's also the risk of massive currency runs. In a multipolar order, if the economy of one currency bloc were to face some sort of crisis, this could trigger a destabilizing flight out of that currency into one of the other alternatives, with destabilizing consequences. There's also a coordination problem. In the inevitable event of a crisis, central banks within different currency blocs will have to work with one another to fight it off effectively, as opposed to the situation at the moment, where the Federal Reserve does most of the firefighting by itself, and the world's other central banks basically just ask it for dollars if needed. More generally, it's possible that no single currency bloc will be willing or able to, on their own, provide the public goods we all currently enjoy under the dollar, like institutionalized free trade policy, a steady supply of safe assets, and super deep capital markets. In this case, the transition from a unipolar to multipolar currency order would be bad for the global economy, and probably politically destabilizing. This potential pitfall is sometimes known as the Kindleberger trap, a concept named after the historian Charles Kindleberger, who argued that the economic chaos of the interwar era was in part a consequence of America's reluctance or inability to assume the responsibilities of global leadership following the decline of the UK as the preeminent world power. If this analysis is correct, it's very possible that, after a brief but turbulent flirtation with the multipolar system, the world once again tends back towards some sort of unipolar currency order. This is obviously a long way off, so it's basically impossible to say what the new dominant currency might be. Maybe it'll be the US dollar again, but a funkier future, perhaps centered around some sort of commodity, much like the gold standard of old, is at least conceivable. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine Too Long is out now, which means that if you order a physical edition, it'll be shipped to you immediately, and if you buy a digital edition, it'll land in your inbox straight away. No pre-ordering, no waiting. Plus, if you subscribe while you're there using code SPRING26, you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. One other thing to know is that if you're more of a listener than a reader, which would be fair enough, we are a YouTube channel after all, then this time round we've recorded every article in Too Long, with each of our writers doing their best audiobook impression while narrating their own articles.
The New Age of Empires. Written and read by Georgina Finley.
If you want that, then you can sign up to our new Too Long and TLDR Party bundle. That gets you a copy of the magazine, but also access to TLDR Party, our new subscription. Party members not only get access to the audio versions of every article, they also get access to our documentaries, like our new series Leaders and Losers and our upcoming documentary we're recording in Greenland right now. They get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, our bonus podcast, The Last Move, their name printed in every issue of our magazine, and more. Find out more about TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to subscribe to Too Long and our documentaries.